The studio lights of The View always had a way of softening edges, giving everything a warm, inviting glow. For millions of daytime viewers, this was a familiar sanctuary. Part talk show, part battleground, always unpredictable. But on this particular morning, the atmosphere was sharper, tighter, almost electric. There was a tension in the room that the audience couldn't quite name, but they could feel it deep in their bones, as if the stage itself knew it was about to host a confrontation that would spill far beyond its polished floors. Taylor Swift entered with her signature grace, a figure whose presence alone seemed to bend the air around her. The cheers were deafening, the studio audience rising to their feet, phones lifted like tiny torches. She smiled, waved, and carried herself to the panel with the polished calm of someone who had done this 1,000 times. To her fans, she was untouchable, America's pop poet, the champion of misfits, the woman who had rewritten the script of stardom on her own terms. But sitting across from her was Whoopi Goldberg, veteran host, cultural icon, and no stranger to cutting through celebrity gloss with a single unflinching remark. Whoopi's eyes tracked Taylor's movements, unreadable, her expression steady but firm. She didn't lean forward in welcome. She didn't beam with fanfare. Instead, she sat back, arms loosely crossed, waiting. It was not hostility, but it was not warmth either. It was the posture of someone preparing for a trial rather than a conversation. The applause faded. Cameras zoomed in. The hosts exchanged pleasantries, their words floating politely through the air. But beneath the scripted introductions, there was an undeniable crackle. The producers had stacked the deck. They knew that Taylor Swift wasn't just there to promote an album. She was there as a cultural lightning rod, a voice that divided as much as it inspired. They also knew that Whoopi Goldberg had little patience for star power unaccompanied by substance. It was the kind of combustible mix that television executives quietly prayed for, the kind that guaranteed headlines. Taylor's voice, when she finally began to speak, was soft but clear, her practiced cadence threading through the audience with ease. She spoke of music, of empowerment, of the journeys that had shaped her. The crowd leaned in, nodding, hanging on each polished word. And yet, as she spoke, Whoopi's posture did not change. The tension between them hung unspoken, but it was visible, Taylor's brightness colliding with Whoopi's storm cloud gravity. Viewers at home would later describe the moment as a slow unraveling, as if two tectonic plates were grinding silently against one another, preparing for an earthquake. On set, though, it was felt in subtler ways. The way a co-host's smile flickered too briefly, the way the audience clapped with a nervous edge, the way a producer's hand hovered too long over the control panel. The energy was building and everyone knew it. Then came the first interruption. It wasn't harsh, just a pointed interjection, but the sound of Whoopi's voice cutting through Taylor's flowing narrative shifted the air immediately. The audience gasped softly, as though someone had cracked glass. Taylor paused, smiled, faintly, and tried to continue, but it was clear that the ground had shifted. This was no longer a performance. This was a duel. In that moment, the show stopped being entertainment and became something else entirely. A confrontation between generations, between celebrity and skepticism, between the carefully curated image of an icon and the raw, unfiltered bluntness of a veteran who refused to yield. The tension radiated beyond the stage, into living rooms across America, where viewers sat upright in their chairs, sensing they were witnessing not just another daytime spat, but something unthinkable, a live television breakdown destined to echo far beyond its broadcast. And as the cameras lingered on Taylor's measured smile and Whoopi's unyielding stare, the audience could feel it in their bones. This wasn't going to end politely. It was the beginning of a cultural collision, and no one, not the producers, not the fans, not even the women themselves, could stop it now. The invitation had seemed like a coup. For months, Taylor Swift's team had been carefully curating, her public image layering her artistry with activism, shaping her not only as a musician but as a cultural force. She was no longer simply a pop star who sold out stadiums. She was the face of ownership battles in the music industry, the artist who stood up to streaming giants, the woman who urged her fans to register to vote. Every public appearance mattered, and her presence on The View was meant to be another chapter in a broader story, the transformation of Taylor Swift into a voice of generational conscience. Producers of The View knew this too. They weren't just booking her for ratings, though those were guaranteed. They were booking her because they wanted friction. For years, the show thrived on the spectacle of unscripted volatility, women with differing worldviews clashing in real time, their arguments echoing through headlines. And Taylor, for all her polish, carried with her an aura of perfection that begged to be tested. Would she hold up under fire? Could she survive the raw unpredictability of Whoopi Goldberg's blunt honesty? Behind the scenes, the invitation had been debated at length. Some producers worried it would be too safe, that Taylor's well-rehearsed talking points would drown out the spontaneity that made The View compelling. Others believed the opposite, that pairing Taylor's carefully crafted optimism with Whoopi's unfiltered bluntness would ignite television magic. In hushed meetings, they whispered about the moment, a phrase that meant more than just good television. It meant virality. Clips replayed endlessly. Social media wars erupting overnight. The kind of cultural explosion that turned daytime chatter into national conversation. Taylor herself had weighed the risks. She remembered years when she was criticized for staying silent, for avoiding politics, for being apolitical, while the world demanded artists to take stands. That silence had haunted her. She had promised herself she would never again shrink from the responsibility of influence. Appearing on The View felt like an opportunity to reaffirm that promise, a stage where she could project strength, eloquence, and conviction to millions of viewers who had watched her grow from teen prodigy to global icon. But if Taylor saw the appearance as a platform for empowerment, Whoopi saw it differently. For Whoopi, television was not a pedestal, but an arena. Guests weren't there to be worshipped, they were there to be questioned, pushed, stripped of illusions, and if she sensed even a sliver of performance or insincerity, she would call it out without hesitation. This had always been her way. Audiences trusted her for it. The producers banked on it. And in Taylor Swift, she saw not just a guest, but a test of whether celebrity activism was rooted in truth or just another performance. The morning of the broadcast, tension simmered beneath the surface. Taylor arrived with her team, dressed in understated elegance, hair perfectly composed, her smile unwavering. She knew the stakes. She knew every word could be weaponized, every pause dissected. As she adjusted her microphone and took her seat at the panel, she inhaled slowly, centering herself. She would project calm, intelligence, grace. She would not be rattled. Meanwhile, Whoopi waited, her notes barely touched. She didn't need preparation to know her angle. She had watched Taylor rise, admired parts of her story, but questioned much of it too. She wasn't interested in flattery. She was interested in truth. And truth in Whoopi's hands was rarely gentle. The invitation, then, was never just an invitation. It was a setup, a stage constructed not only for conversation, but for collision. And as the cameras began their silent countdown, neither woman, not Taylor with her conviction, nor Whoopi with her steel, seemed willing to yield. What the producers had engineered was not an interview. It was a duel disguised as dialogue. And the world, though it didn't know it yet, was about to watch it all unfold live. Whoopi Goldberg had long been more than just a host. She was the gravitational force of The View, the anchor around which the panel rotated, the voice that could silence a crowd with one sharp remark. Decades of work had carved her into something larger than a celebrity. She was a truth-teller, a survivor, a performer, and a judge all rolled into one. Her chair at the table wasn't merely a seat. It was a throne forged from credibility and fearlessness. For nearly 2 decades, Whoopi had defined the rhythm of the show. She had a way of letting debates unfurl until they teetered on chaos, only to reel them back with a line so cutting, so precise it left everyone else stunned into silence. Viewers trusted her for that. She wasn't swayed by popularity, nor was she intimidated by power. Politicians, actors, athletes, none had escaped her glare when she sensed their words carried spin instead of substance. Behind the warmth of her laughter and the casual ease of her delivery lay a sharper philosophy. She believed in tearing away the mask. For Whoopi, celebrity was never enough. Status was irrelevant. What mattered was truth, and truth often came at the cost of comfort. That morning, as the studio lights warmed the stage, she leaned back in her chair, arms relaxed but posture commanding. Her expression betrayed little, yet the room tilted in her direction. Co-hosts knew the signs. The audience, even if unconsciously, felt it too. This was Whoopi in her element, still quiet, but ready to strike the moment she sensed weakness. Taylor Swift's entrance had been met with a wave of admiration, yet Whoopi did not join the ovation. She had smiled politely, offered her welcome, but her eyes remained calculating. For her, Taylor was not simply a guest. She was a phenomenon, a billion-dollar empire draped in sequins and sincerity. And with phenomena came responsibility. Whoopi's instinct was to probe that responsibility, to measure whether it was authentic conviction or carefully engineered branding. There had been others before Taylor, politicians who thought they could charm their way through an interview, only to be cut down by Whoopi's bluntness. Celebrities who tried to dance around controversy, only to be cornered by a question they couldn't dodge. She had weathered accusations, scandals, even boycotts, but she remained unshaken because she never played the game of popularity. For Whoopi, it was never about applause. It was about accountability. Taylor's presence, however, was unlike any other. Few guests carried the adoration she did, the cultural power that hovered like armor around her. She had built her career on connection, on songs that turned personal heartbreaks into universal anthems. Millions saw her as untouchable. That aura was both her strength and her shield. And Whoopi, perhaps more than anyone else, understood what it meant to pierce a shield. As introductions rolled on, the co-hosts played their roles, laughing, smiling, softening the mood. But the undercurrent was unmistakable. Everyone at the table knew this was not going to be a gentle segment. Whoopi had that look in her eye, steady, unblinking, as if she were already dissecting Taylor's words before they left her lips. In the control booth, producers whispered to each other, half thrilled, half anxious. They had seen this posture before. It meant Whoopi was ready to push, to prod, to take the conversation into territory that couldn't be scripted. They wanted tension, but tension in Whoopi's hands often became something volcanic. For the audience in the studio, it was felt more viscerally. A laugh cut too quickly short. Applause that didn't quite cover the nervous glances between co-hosts. Even before the first question was asked, the stage was weighted with anticipation. Taylor's polished smile met Whoopi's guarded stare. Two women, both cultural powerhouses, both accustomed to commanding rooms, sat opposite each other, their differences invisible, yet palpable. Taylor spoke of empowerment. Whoopi embodied it. Taylor projected carefully chosen words. Whoopi wielded unsparing bluntness. And somewhere in that fragile space between them, the clash began to take shape, not yet in words, but in posture, in silence, in the quiet certainty that neither was prepared to yield. It was no longer a talk show. It was a trial waiting to begin. The first few moments belonged to Taylor. The hosts, as they often did with major celebrity guests, gave her the floor to tell her story in her own words. The cameras zoomed in, catching the softness in her eyes, the faint curve of her lips as she began. "I've always believed music can be a kind of mirror," she said, her voice clear and measured. "It reflects the times we live in, the struggles we face, and sometimes it gives people permission to feel things they've been taught to bury." The audience responded instantly with applause, a warm, affirming wave that seemed to wash over her. Taylor smiled, dipping her head in gratitude. She had said these words before, but never without meaning them. Every syllable carried the practiced polish of someone who knew the weight of live television, She continued speaking about her battles for ownership of her masters, the infamous struggle with Scooter Braun, and the corporate machine that once held her life's work hostage. Her words were smooth, but the passion was real, her eyes flashing when she described what it meant to reclaim her art. No artist should have to fight this hard to own the songs they wrote in their bedroom as kids, she said, leaning slightly forward, the faintest tremor of conviction in her tone. It's not just about me. It's about every young songwriter who deserves to keep their own voice. The crowd erupted again. Co-hosts nodded along, some scribbling notes, others smiling, with admiration. It was Taylor at her strongest, polished yet vulnerable, eloquent yet relatable. She was not only performing, she was testifying, carefully building her case before an unseen jury, the millions of viewers watching from their homes. But beneath the smoothness, there was a flicker of something else. Taylor was no stranger to criticism. She knew what was coming. She could sense the weight of Whoopi's silence, feel the gravity of that unblinking gaze locked on her from across the table. She straightened her shoulders, brushed a strand of hair back from her face, and pressed on, determined to maintain control of the narrative. She shifted toward her activism, recounting her decision to break years of political silence. She spoke about encouraging young fans to register to vote, about taking public stances on LGBTQ+ rights and women's equality. For a long time, I thought being silent was being safe, she admitted, her voice softening. But silence is a choice too, and it often benefits the people who already have power. I couldn't live with that anymore. The studio audience hummed with approval, a mixture of claps and murmurs of support. Taylor's gaze swept across the room, and for a moment her confidence seemed unshakable. She was in control, guiding the energy, painting herself as both artist and advocate. But across the table, Whoopi didn't clap. She didn't nod. She tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of her lips. It wasn't amusement. It was recognition, the look of someone who had heard countless polished testimonies and knew when to press deeper. Taylor noticed. For just a second, her rhythm faltered, her hand tightening against the edge of the table before she quickly smoothed it into her lap. She resumed, her voice steady, but the tension was visible in the way her breaths quickened, in the way she darted a glance toward Whoopi before redirecting her eyes to the audience. It was a subtle duel, invisible to most, but in those glances, the room understood. Taylor was not just speaking to her fans anymore. She was speaking to Whoopi, and Whoopi was waiting for her to slip. When Taylor concluded her opening remarks, the studio filled with another round of applause, longer, louder, almost protective. The audience wanted her to succeed, to keep shining in the face of scrutiny. But as the sound faded, an uneasy silence followed, because everyone knew the applause wasn't the real test. The real test was about to come from the woman who had remained silent all this time, the one whose very presence could turn adoration into interrogation. And as Taylor adjusted the microphone before her, flashing a polite, composed smile, Whoopi leaned forward at last. The duel, long foreshadowed, was about to begin.